Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've had a couple of different union leaders on to talk about the response to COVID-19 and what's going on. And so I'm joined tonight by Katha Fortier. She is the assistant to the national president of Unifor. Katha, welcome to our show. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you for having me, Brian.
Thank you. Can you first start out by telling us who's Unifor? Who do they represent?
Well, Unifor has about 315,000 members across Canada, and we represent members in about 20 different sectors of the union, but of those 20 different sectors, 30,000 of our members are healthcare workers, healthcare and social services.
And so what's your concern with COVID-19 and how the government has responded? Is it an issue of personal protective equipment that you're really concerned about?
Well, it's a number of issues, quite frankly. We represent in Ontario about 15,000 long-term care workers. And I have to say that the concerns are certainly pre-COVID. We've had issues with the amount of care in long-term care homes, in particular, a shortage of personal support workers that's been increasing for the last decade, and it's gotten to a point where even before COVID came along, which was a pandemic that of course exploded in the long-term care sector with over 80% of the deaths in Canada attributed to long-term care homes. There were problems. There were severe problems. There were shortages of personal support workers, and we'd identified this on several occasions. Most recently, we partnered with the Ontario Health Coalition to do a series of roundtables on personal support workers shortages across the province of Ontario. We released that report last December the 9th, and that really just highlighted, again, the roundtables that we held. We invited personal support workers, of course, but we had employers, we had government representatives, we had representatives from the college, from family councils, and we really wanted to dig down and find out what was causing the shortage of personal support workers. We knew that it was a revolving door, and we found out some of the reasons why. Quite frankly, sometimes people weren't staying for their first shift in a long-term care home. And there was a few reasons. First of all, the workload became overwhelming. The ratio of residents, personal support workers to a resident on a day shift is often as much as 1 to 12, if you can imagine. 2 years prior to this, we actually did a video called the 6-Minute Challenge, and that video outlined that a personal support worker working in a long-term care home has about 6 minutes to get every resident that they're responsible to care for out of bed, perform all of their personal care, and get them to the dining room for breakfast. It's really asking...
Sorry, I apologize. 6 minutes each or 6 minutes in total?
6 minutes for each resident to provide all of their personal care and get them to the dining room for breakfast. So that's brushing their teeth, that's getting them dressed, toileting, whatever personal care that they require. And it was really just impossible. So our challenge was about asking people to just see what they could do in 6 minutes when they got up in the morning. Could they actually get themselves ready and presentable within 6 minutes? And of course, it's pretty impossible. But obviously this was 2017 when we did the challenge, and we were getting some movement at that time. If you remember, we had a different government in Ontario. There was a bill called the Time to Care Act that was introduced by the NDP. And at that point, it had passed second reading unanimously. And what that act would have done would have brought back a minimum measurable enforceable standard of care. It's measured in hours per day, and that would have brought that back in so that when compliance officer goes into a nursing home and finds various things wrong, that they'd actually say, you don't have enough staff working here today to provide proper care. And we know that that's critical. We know that the ratios are far too high, and we know people are simply, personal support workers are just leaving the industry in droves. So just back to the report that we did, the roundtables, we discovered a whole lot of things. People were leaving, quite frankly, for a number of reasons. First of all, the unbelievable workload that they were given and the responsibilities they were given were just outright overwhelming. And secondly, the compensation wasn't that great. Most of nursing homes in Ontario are run by for-profit operators. The starting wage is about $18 an hour. And if you add to that, you can't get a full-time job. So if you want to work in the industry, you have to work at 2 or 3 nursing homes to be able to, if you plan on supporting yourself, and or if, God forbid, you have a family to support, you really have to work 2 or 3 jobs, which, we saw, obviously the government stopped that during COVID, but literally that was taking groceries out of people's pockets, that they needed this money that they were earning working in more than one home. The other challenge in long-term care has been around wages and compensation. And again, as I've said, employers don't like to hire you full-time. They like to keep you part-time or casual. And that's simply so that they don't have to give you benefits, that in most cases they don't have to give you sick pay. And it's cheaper, quite frankly, for them to have that kind of workforce. And the other thing is that for nursing home workers, it's illegal for them to go on strike. So they're stuck in a system of arbitration. And all of the awards essentially in the province over the last decade have been set by arbitrators who, I would just say, have not been particularly kind to nursing home workers and frontline workers in that industry.
Right.
In the last decade, they've had every wage increase that they've had has been below inflation, as well as a 2-year wage freeze. So, this sort of just builds up to that point where you have a complete shortage of workers. You're working, the inside term is working short. And that means that, sometimes somebody calls in sick or might even be on a vacation day or a holiday.
You don't have coverage. We're chatting with Katha Fortier, the assistant to the national president of Unifor, about the problems in long-term care facilities. We're going to take a break for messages and come right back with more. Just wait a minute for us.
Hello.
Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Chatting tonight with Katha Fortier, the assistant to the national president of Unifor, a big labor union here in Ontario and Canada. And Katha and Unifor represent a substantial amount of long-term care workers. And she's just run through a bunch of the problems that are endemic to the industry. And I think what you called it is working short. And a lot of people we're working numerous jobs for low money and had to work at several different long-term care facilities to make ends meet. I understand all those problems, but why did that create such a situation where, as a lot of people have said, it's almost a black mark on Canada for what's happened. Like, not almost, it is a black mark on Canada, what's happened in long-term care during COVID-19. The 80% of the mortality that you identified that's occurred in the long-term care facilities, it's astounding. It's shocking, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it is a collective shame. And I see right now there's a lot of polling that's saying that fixing long-term care should be a priority. When COVID hit these nursing homes, it hit incredibly hard. And if you can imagine already being short the workforce that you need to provide the care on a regular basis, and again, you're working short. So instead of being responsible for a dozen residents, maybe that's now 16 or 18 residents. So imagine when COVID comes in and the staff are getting sick and the residents are getting sick, and you're taking precautions. And even when you have proper PPE, which, believe me, was not always the case in long-term care homes, as this went on, we certainly recognized that and did everything that we could in our power to make sure frontline workers had PPE. But this was just ravaging these homes. There was not enough care for them.
How was it ravaging? Do you think it was employees that were bringing the infection in and then going from room to room in that 6-minute time frame that you were identifying, infecting all of the people in their care?
Well, I mean, it could be that staff brought this into the home. Obviously, that's a possibility. There's also, if you remember, visitors weren't stopped. So residents were having visitors, so they could have brought COVID into the homes. Nobody was ordered initially to wear masks at the beginning of COVID. So, you had sort of a combination of things. But the reality is that, I mean, if you think of the type of residents that live in a nursing home today, and you think of the care needs that they have, for instance, they're so varied. You could have somebody that's very frail and has a lot of physical ailments and, is unable to do any of their own self-care. You could have a younger, stronger, mentally ill person that's maybe 50 years old, living in that nursing home, that's mobile and walking around and has lots of social needs. So to sort of contain a disease like COVID that spreads obviously fairly easily could be difficult. You need to sort of, the term they use, the insider term is cohorting, and you want to prevent cohorting. You want to prevent the residents from coming in contact with each other, particularly residents that are sick, from residents that aren't sick.
I would have thought we would have had experience just with the annual flu and known how to insulate residents from each other and from workers with flus on an annual basis.
Well, it's interesting because I think the comparisons, people think that COVID is just like your typical flu, and it's proven that it is just not the case. It seems to just transmit far more easier, and it really is. It's been just difficult to contain, as we've seen. It's just, there's not as many similarities. For instance, we know now that we should be wearing masks, and in fact, probably about a month or so in, all staff were required to wear masks regardless. But that precaution would not have needed to be taken with flu. So there's some really significant differences.
It's just astounding to me that so many deaths have occurred. It's just shocking, and clearly. There's something about maybe the 6-minute time frame that you talked about, that they've got to go so quickly. The personal care workers have got to go so quickly between rooms, and I worry that they're not washing their hands, and they're not taking some of the precautions that we would normally want to take if they had a little bit more time. PPE clearly has been an issue. I'm not sure what have your union members been telling you about the availability of PPE?
Yeah, I mean, everything's been a challenge, and quite frankly, what's happened in long-term care can only be described as a tragedy. We've had issues. We've had some of our homes where our worker that have been in what would be considered the code red outbreaks, and those have been really, really devastating. Where we've seen dozens of residents that have died. We actually one thing nobody talks about, but 11 healthcare workers have died in Ontario, and 8 of them have been personal support workers. So, that really shows you that the people that are charged with giving the most personal of care to a resident is really the most at risk in this system. And quite frankly, the ability, if you can imagine, putting the time that it takes to put on the proper PPE. We've had issues where gowns have been a shortage, so staff are using garbage bags. We've had, the face shields that they're given to use are only a frontal face shield. They don't cover the sides, which they know we need to be covered. And then you're working with, residents who can be, and I mean, it's got to be very disturbing as a resident when, your healthcare worker is covered in PPE and you can't see their face. And if you can imagine, it's not that hard to get your face shield knocked off, whether accidentally or, somebody's just in distress. So these sorts of things are just a real risk for those workers. The long-term care homes were, and I get that the Premier said, if your home is short, call my office and we're going to get you PPE, but that wasn't the reality that played out in the homes. And add to that the shortage. I had a personal support worker call me when her home was reaching a crisis point, and a lot of the staff were getting sick as well. And quite frankly, some of the staff were just terrified to come to work. They may be immune compromised, or maybe have a child or a parent that they live with that's immune compromised. So there was a lot of fear as well for people going to work. So you can imagine being that short staffed. And I remember a PSW calling me and saying, there's 2 PSWs here today for 60 residents. 2 of us for 60 residents.
So it's this working short that you're talking about.
Yes.
So, you mentioned in our opening couple of minutes that a lot of these long-term care are for profit. Is there something wrong with our model of providing long-term care?
I believe there is. So this in 1995, coincidentally, when Mike Harris was elected, there used to be a minimum measurable standard of care. I mentioned that earlier. But nursing homes in 1995, in the 90s, and the early 90s and 80s didn't look like they did right now. People actually drove cars that lived in a nursing home. They were ambulatory, they moved around, but we did have a minimum care standard that said, you have to provide enough care so that it's an average of 2.25 hours of care for every resident in there. And there was a standard. It was much lower than what's needed now because the residents were much more agile. And quite frankly, the sickest and the most fragile seniors that had complex issues weren't in nursing homes. They were in complex continuing care beds or chronic care hospital beds. Through the late 90s, you'll remember the restructuring committee that roared through Ontario closed thousands of chronic care hospital beds. And what they did is they opened nursing homes. And they opened that's when we saw the huge growth of for-profit nursing homes in Ontario, where they then began to outnumber the not-for-profit, the municipals, the charitables, the churches and hospitals that were essentially operating nursing homes on a not-for-profit basis began to get outnumbered by the for-profits. But those residents that were in those chronic care hospital beds didn't disappear. They all moved into the nursing home system. So you made a system that was for profit. You took away the minimum measurable enforceable standard of care, and you left it with profit for the value for putting that over residents' needs. So it was just really a recipe for disaster. And unfortunately, there's been some attention to it over the years for various things, usually one crisis or another. Obviously the Wettlaufer case was a tragedy, but these things are much more difficult to occur when you have a reasonable staffing complement, where you have people that are actually able to examine the residents, spend time with the residents, look for symptoms, look for all sorts of things. And
is the staffing complement different in for-profit versus not-for-profit, or it really only changes when you have that regulatory minimum standard that you mentioned?
Well, our experience with our members, because we represent members in both systems, in the for-profit and in the not-for-profit system. Our experience has been, first of all, municipal homes and regional run homes are much better levels of care. You have higher wages, better benefits. You have accountability, because obviously there's a municipal council that was responsible for operating that nursing home. And they're not taking money out of the system to put into profits. In fact, some of these places actually put money into care. So there's the difference. And we also find with charitable organizations like, churches and some hospitals still run nursing homes. Our experience has been that things are better. They're not perfect, by the way, because long-term care has been a bit of a dumping ground. And as I've said, we closed those thousands of chronic care hospital beds, but we also closed thousands of psychiatric care beds in the province as well. And so many of those psychiatric patients, even if they're not seniors, have ended up in nursing homes.
Really? And so what do you think the solution is? Should we be nationalizing the long-term care business and having it all state-owned and state-run?
Well, I think that COVID has shown us that the system right now is ill-prepared to handle this, and that as much as there's enforcement officers and compliance officers that are trying to do the right thing, the one thing that they can never go into a home and say is that you don't have enough staff working here today. They can say the size of the teaspoon you're using isn't correct, but they can't actually say you don't have enough staff here to provide the care. And so that's really frustrating.
Why can they comment on a teaspoon and not the number of staff?
Because we do not have a standard. We do not have.
We have a standard for teaspoons and we don't have a standard for staff?
That's right.
You're kidding me.
Everything is regulated from, the size of a room to, it's very well regulated. This is not an industry that isn't regulated, but the regulations are in the wrong spot. I
just want to confirm something. Are you actually telling me there is a regulation for the size of a teaspoon?
Yes, they can come in, and if your resident is being fed and they don't like the size of the spoon, that could be a write-up for somebody. you know, as much as, first of all, you know, just giving somebody a drink of water, if you're not sitting down in front of them to give them the drink of water, if you're just maybe walking by and help somebody have a sip of water, that's, you could be written up for that.
But yet, if we are running short because we don't have enough staff and they're not able to spend the 6 minutes, they're down to 4 minutes. That's not something that is a standard that is regulated and can be enforced or written up.
That's right. That's right. So I really think national standards are important. I think, you know, I don't know that people are thinking that the care for profit is a model that works anymore. And I have to say that I'm certainly in that camp. I think we have to think about how we phase this out, how we bring in standards, and how we really just improve the industry. I mean, we've got to do better with wages. We've got to do, I mean, if you see what they did in Quebec, the premier announced in Quebec, about 3 weeks ago, I believe, was he's going to hire 10,000 personal support workers. He's going to pay them $21 an hour to train them. And then when they're done their training in 3 months, obviously some sort of compressed training, they're going to be paid $21 an hour for training. They will be paid $26 an hour and have full-time jobs with a government pension. So, you know, I think treating the workers with some sort of respect and dignity is really important.
And is that something that he's forcing on the for-profit industry as well, or is that just something for provincially owned long-term care facilities?
Well, I believe, and again, the translation, my last name is Fortier, but I don't speak French, but I believe this is just sort of system-wide that they're going to be implementing these positions. I mean, I don't think you can exclude the fact that you have to, the for-profits are there and you have to make sure they're staffed properly.
Have you seen a model internationally that works far better?
Yeah, there are several models that work far differently. You can see, first of all, the ratios in some countries like Sweden. We've worked with Professor Pat Armstrong, who's done a lot of studies internationally on models of care. And, you know, there's a, you know, sort of it's resident based, but it's based on their needs, and where, you know, you actually have staff that, you know, if the resident wants to go for a walk, then that's what you do right then and there. There's not sort of these demands and the strictness on the regulation of care and what you do when, and, you know, you must be in the dining room by 8:15 for breakfast, or, you know, it's sort of more resident centered around the residents' needs. And the biggest thing, of course, is that you see more caregivers, more people there to provide the care and spend the time with those residents.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on our show tonight to talk about this problem, because as you mentioned, 80% of all of the mortality with COVID-19 has occurred in long-term care facilities. It's certainly a black mark, and probably far worse than a black mark. It's a tragedy. And I think COVID-19, lots of people have mentioned this, have sort of accelerated our thinking or could accelerate our thinking in a lot of different areas, because it's been this incredible condensed time period where we see what happens in long-term care, we see what happens in hospitals, we see what happens in a lot of other circumstances. And so I think this is a problem that needs to be addressed, and I look forward to your union contributing to the conversation, if not leading the conversation, on how we're going to change things. So Katha Fortier, the assistant to the national president of Unifor, thank you very much for coming on our show tonight.
Thanks so much for having me, Brian.
Thank you. We're going to take a break and come back in just a minute. Bye-bye.